continuing with our series on plant reproductive biology. Today we will be talking about a very interesting phenomenon, which is pollination. So far we have talked about the flower structure in angiosperms, and you are well aware that a typical flower in angiosperms has 4 whorls. The outermost being the calyx, then corolla, and of course there are androecium and gynoecium, which are the male and the female reproductive structures of flowers. Now this reproduction cannot happen without pollination. Now in this particular slide you can see that there is a wide range of flowers. They are different in colors, in shapes, and even the arrangement of the sex organs in each of these flowers is different. So what you see here is that the sex organs, that is the male and the female reproductive structures, or we can say the anther and the pistil, they are exposed. The flowers have opened to expose the sex organs in these flowers. Now this phenomenon, when the flower has reached its full development and it is ready for fertilization, that time the flower opens and it exposes its sex organs for further process of reproduction, and this opening of a mature flower is what we call as anthesis. So you can see here different types of flowers at anthesis. Some flowers, they do not open at anthesis, that is when the sex organs are mature, they remain in a closed bud like situation. Such flowers are called as the cleistogamous flowers. Now why should a plant have a flower which will not open, that is it is not exposing its sex organs to the pollinators? Now this phenomenon of kleistogamy is basically very important because all such flowers, they are self-pollinated, and this ensures that there is augmentation of population even when the periods are not very favorable. The flowers which expose their anthers and stigma, which open at maturity, they are called as the chasmogamous flowers. Now a chasmogamous flower has an option to either be pollinated itself, that is it can be self-pollinated, or it can even depend on some external agencies for pollination. Now in this slide you see that there are 2 pictures. The one on the left where you see yellow flowers which have opened to expose their sex organs, these are the chasmogamous flowers, and this is in Viola pubescens. On the right hand side, the arrow indicates a small flower bud which is closed, that too is seen in Viola, and this is the cleistogamous flower. I would like to bring to your notice that this act of transfer of pollen from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same or to a different flower, that is what we call as pollination. So pollination is a very crucial step in the reproductive biology or in the reproductive process of flowering plants. This transfer of pollen from anther to the stigma is the primary step in reproduction, and it happens on a conspecific stigma. That means the stigma has to be of the same species, and the mechanism of pollination can take place by different agencies. Pollination is also the basis for genetic heterogeneity, which is very important in the overall evolution of plants. When we study the methods of pollination and then subsequently fertilization, which is the next step after pollination, the whole process or the whole study is referred to as pollination biology. As mentioned earlier also, pollination services are rendered by various biotic and abiotic agencies. Most of the flowers in angiospermous families, they rely on external agents for transfer of pollen, and these external agents could be like anything from insects, birds, bats, wind, water, and they depend. Now, whenever we have the biotic pollinators, they are dependent for their nutritional requirements on these plants, especially the requirement for nutrition is more so during their breeding periods. Now, what does a plant gain by providing nourishment to the pollinator? In lieu of this service, pollinator gets reward, access to food, pollen and nectar. So, pollination is performed, that is the act of transfer of pollen from anther to the stigma is performed by a pollinator, which could be insect, bird, bat, etc., whatever. Now, the plant is getting pollinated and the pollinator is getting access to the nutrition, which can be in terms of pollen or nectar. Such mutually beneficial relationship between the angiosperms and the pollinators, this has led to co-evolution and adaptation among these groups over millions of years. So, what happens is that flowers have also adapted themselves to suit the pollinator. Supposing the pollinator is a bird and it has a very long beak. So, probably the shape of the flower will be tubular, so that the beak of the bird can easily reach the bottom of the flower where it can access the nectaries. So, diverse floral features, color, form, nectar and scent of flowers, they are associated with different modes of pollination. Now, this is what we call as the pollination syndrome. Pollination services are very essential for the process of fertilization, and without this process there can be no genetic variability. Hence, the process of pollination, it increases genetic variability, more so in those species which are cross-pollinated. Pollination primarily is of two types, like we have been talking so far. It is self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is occurring within the same flower. Cross-pollination primarily requires some kind of an agency for the transfer of pollen. Self-pollination can be further divided into autogamy and geitonogamy. Now, when I say self-pollination, it means that there is transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower or a different flower, but which is present on the same plant. Now, this can happen if it is happening in the same flower, that means the flower has to have both types of sex organs. So, the flowers where self-pollination occurs, they can be bisexual or they are hermaphroditic flowers. Also, the anthers and the stigmas in such flowers, they are located very close to each other, so that easily the pollen can reach the stigmas. It is important for the anther to dehisce at a time when the stigma is ready to receive the pollen grains. So, the time of anther dehiscence and of the receptivity of stigma has to be the same in order for self-pollination to occur. In case this time is different, then probably the plant has to resort to cross-pollination. There is certainty of pollination in case of self-pollination, and there is no dependence on any type of external agency for the transfer of pollen. Cross-pollination, on the other hand, is when the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of a different plant, but the plant is of the same species. Now, cross-pollination has several evolutionary advantages, and it also promotes genetic heterogeneity, which leads to increase in phenotypic variability within a population. I would like to mention here that this genetic heterogeneity is very important in the overall adaptability and evolution of any species. Cross-pollination requires transfer of gametes between individuals. This can happen through biotic or abiotic agencies. Now, in the absence or in the scarcity of pollinators, that is biotic pollinators, sexual reproduction can sometimes fail to occur. But now here the advantage of self-pollination comes in, where there is no dependence on any pollinator for the transfer of pollen grains. Cross-pollinated plants, they adapt to a wider range of environmental conditions, because like I said that because of this genetic heterogeneity which is observed in them, they are more adaptable. Coming back to the types of pollination, earlier I told you that we have self-pollination and we have cross-pollination. Self-pollination is when the pollen are transferred from anther to the stigma of the same flower or to another flower on the same plant. Okay. Now, we further divide this. Autogamy we say when the pollen grains from an anther are transferred to the stigma of the same flower. It is also referred to as intrafloral selfing. When the pollen is transferred from anther of the same when the pollen is transferred from anther to the stigma of another flower which is present on the same or on the different plant, then this phenomenon is allogamy, and this is further divided into gytenogamy and xenogamy. So, when the pollen is transferred from anther to stigma of another flower on the same plant, okay, this is interfloral selfing, or it is transferred to a flower on another plant of the same clone, that is the ramid. This is called as gytenogamy. When the pollen transfer is done from an anther to stigma of a different plant of the same species. So, here it is the genet where it is transferred, it is called as xenogamy. More so we will refer to xenogamy as cross pollination. Now, in this particular picture you can see that in figure A, the pollen is being transferred to the stigma of the same flower, and this is called as the autogamy. It is the same flower. Now, in the second one where it is written gytenogamy, the pollen is being transferred from the anther to the stigma of another flower, but that flower is present on the same plant. Third one is xenogamy, where the pollen is transferred to another flower on a different plant. Okay. Both autogamy and gytenogamy, they occur on the same plant, hence they qualify for being considered as self-pollination. Only xenogamy is considered cross-pollination. Now, autogamy, because if the flower is open, it may or may not require pollen transferring agents. For gytenogamy and xenogamy, presence of pollinating agents is essential, because if the pollen has to transfer, it has to move to another flower, maybe in the close vicinity. If there is no biological agent, then maybe it is the wind or the water which will transfer this pollen. So, there is requirement of some pollinating agent for this process. There are certain advantages of self-pollination, because self-pollination helps the species to tide over periods when animal pollinators are temporarily scarce. Sometimes this can happen when the environmental conditions are very harsh, if the temperature is too high or there is incessant rain. In those cases, the availability of pollinator becomes difficult. Self-pollinated species, they basically adopted successfully by some plant, this mechanism is adopted successfully by some plant species whose natural pollinators over the course of time have died out. Continued selfing is practiced in many food crop plants because whatever feature is required, now by continuous selfing, this enables farmers to grow a desired genotype because there is no cross pollination, there is no heterogeneity, there is no change in the genotype. Such species, they produce abundant seeds for rapid and massive colonization of any bare ground area that is available. Self-pollination, like I said, is a foolproof method of perpetuation of a species whenever the environmental conditions are stable, but it is an evolutionary dead end because there is hardly any evolution happening. Cross-pollination, on the other hand, carries certain evolutionary advantages. Now, the first advantage is that the seeds which are formed after cross pollination, they may have hereditary traits of both the parents, which results in the variation occurring in the offspring. Individuals may be better equipped to cope in a changing environment, ensuring survival of species, and also cross pollination results in better quality seeds. Hybrid corn, which we use these days, it is a result of cross breeding of several especially bred lines. Now, whenever this self-pollination has to take place, there are certain mechanisms which favor or which promote self-pollination. Now, like we have already discussed, that self-pollination occurs in those flowers where both type of sex organs are present. So, bisexuality is one feature which is important for occurrence of self-pollination. Presence of anthers and stigma in the same flower. Now, another thing is that of course, there is presence of anthers and stigma in the same flower, but they should be also maturing at the same time, and this phenomenon is called as homogamy. Third mechanism which promotes self-pollination is cleistogamy. We have already talked about cleistogamy briefly, that is pollination within a closed flower without exposing the sex organs. Now, this is also called as a closed marriage. The fourth feature here is that the anthers and stigmas, they are close together and they may curve or move towards each other in the longer run and facilitate pollination. So, if the anthers and stigmas are very close to each other, whenever the anthers will dehisce, all the pollen will fall on the stigma if it is nearby. There are two pictures depicting self-pollination here. Picture A is a feature or it is a picture of a member of family Podostomaceae. So, you can see that the perianth has been removed here. You can see a pistil which comprises of two stigmas and an ovary. There is no style here, and on the lateral side is present the anther filament which is hosting two anthers at the top. Now, what you see here is that the stigma is bifid and in between the two lips of the stigma is present the fork of this anther filament. Now, whenever these anthers will mature and the anther will dehisce, automatically as the picture indicates, all the pollen will fall on the stigma which is just below the anthers. So, this kind of an arrangement, this is clasping of stigma by anthers which is happening just before the dehiscence, which promotes self-pollination. The second picture is of Utricularia flower, and this is a scanning electron micrograph where you can see that there are two anther lobes and there is a stigma. Now in reality the stigma is more like, the pistil is flask shaped and the stigma, it has papillations which are present on the surface, and this, the stigmata, the flap of the stigma, it rolls backwards towards the anthers, and anthers when mature they will dehisce, and en masse all the pollen are lodged onto the stigmatic papillae. All this happens while the flower is closed. So, it will open, it will actually open and become a chasmogamous flowers, but at this stage where we have taken this picture, the flower is closed. So, since it is before the opening cleistogamy, it is called as the pre-anthesis cleistogamy, and this is how self-pollination or autogamy occurs in both Podostymaceae and in Utricularia. It is said that cleistogamy is the most efficient floral adaptation for promoting self-pollination. Now this when we talk about cleistogamy, it can be inherent, that is it is constitutional, or it can even be ecological, that is it is induced by severe environmental conditions. Commelina bengalensis is one species where there is occurrence of cleistogamy. The plant starts producing cleistogamous flowers under severe environmental conditions. Severe environmental conditions are primarily arising out of very high temperatures. So, if the temperature is really high, then normal pollination is not possible, especially if there are biotic pollinators involved. So, you see here on the left hand side there are nice blue, violet, bright flowers which can be seen in figure A. These are chasmogamous flowers which open to expose their sex organs, and these blue flowers, these are pollinated by insects. The same plant lower down, it has these dull flowers which you can see in B figure. These flowers are dull underground and they are borne on a subcutaneous rhizome. Under certain conditions, the plants which produce these bright blue open flowers, they start producing these cleistogamous flowers. It is basically when the conditions are not favorable for floral visitors to visit the flowers. So, in order to continue the perpetuation of a species, Commelina has adopted this mechanism of producing two types of flowers in the same season. Indigofera is another example of self-pollination, and this Indigofera is found in the world's hottest desert of Timbuktu. Aerial flowers are about 5 to 6 feet above ground. Now, above ground the atmospheric temperature is 40 to 45 degrees centigrade, and the flowers are pollinated by bees. Those flowers which are present on the ground, they lack pollinators, as the temperature at the ground surface can go up to even 80 degrees centigrade all through the year. So, these flowers which are present at the ground surface, these are cleistogamous. They are self-pollinated to prevent the flowers from desiccation, because when the flower will open, it will expose its sex organs and the extremely hot temperature will dry out or desiccate the flowers. Now, this formation of cleistogamous flowers is an adaptation for survival. Now, when we talk about cross pollination, that is whenever there is some external agency involved in pollination, there can be two types of agencies: abiotic agencies and biotic agencies. Now, you know that abiotic agencies are wind and water. When the pollination is favored by wind, we call it as anemophily, and when water is the agent for pollination, the process is called hydrophily. Biotic agencies can be anything like insects, bats, butterflies, moths, birds, snails, sometimes even lemurs are there, and different type of biotic agent leads to a different type of pollination. Like pollination by insects is entomophily, it is the most prevalent type of pollination. Pollination by bats is chiroterophily, and by birds is ornithophily. In the next class, we will be talking about cross pollination in detail. Thank you.